One word sums up the psychological study of racism: changing. The way society views race and racism has evolved, as has the psychological discourse. Going into the year 2020, many Americans, especially white Americans, were naive. When the coronavirus epidemic began, complacency gave way to worry and unease. On May 25, 2020, when George Floyd was slain in police custody, a bright spotlight was shown to an uncomfortable reality that most BIPOC Americans already knew. Racism is still alive and thriving in America. Watch the video to find out why. Hey guys, welcome to another exciting video from our channel. In today's video, we are going to talk about how the mind of a racist functions, but before we get into it, please subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon to never miss a video from us. That said, now let's begin. The social psychological approach to studying racism has traditionally concentrated on individual psychology, how racism is caused by individual people's beliefs and behaviors. However, perceiving racism only via this lens has serious drawbacks. Because of Charles Darwin's concept of survival of the fittest, early psychological theories of racism justified the dominance of one race over another. It was hypothesized that being racist provided a survival advantage. Two modern hunter-gatherer tribes, on the other hand, were not discovered to exclude outgroups, those who were not a part of a specific group. Hence, this problematic notion was dismissed. Racism was often explained as inherently racist in the beginning. Modern perspectives on racism examine how racism is sustained on a societal and cultural level, rather than just individual actions of prejudice. The notions of racism and prejudice are often misunderstood and conflated. They are not identical despite their similarities. A negative perception or attitude towards a member of a group based on shared qualities such as race, ethnicity, sex, sexuality, age, religion, language, class, or culture is known as prejudice. For instance, prejudice might be racist, but it can also be sexist, ageist, or classist. Prejudiced views are formed early in life and can influence behavior in both subtle and overt ways. For example, a prejudiced teacher might believe that girls aren't strong at math. The teacher's actions with their students would therefore be influenced by this idea, whether consciously or subconsciously. Racism, on the other hand, is directed at a certain racial group and is founded on oppressive power structures. Racism is sometimes viewed as a problem of individual racial prejudice, but it is critical to understand that it is considerably more complex and systematic. Racism is often thought of in terms of overt individual acts and ideology, the social psychological understanding, but it can also be found inside institutions, organizations, and cultures, the cultural psychological understanding. Racism is thus ingrained in the fabric of everyday life. It is often difficult for people to notice how familiar and mainstream concepts encourage prejudiced perspectives and behaviors, since racism is ingrained in American culture, cultural patterns, and historical narratives. Racism isn't only about people displaying racial prejudice or engaging in overt acts of racial discrimination. It also affects institutions like the judicial system, where Black defendants are often sentenced to harsher penalties than white defendants for the same offenses. While most overt acts of racism are no longer permitted or accepted in mainstream, contemporary American society, our perception of what constitutes racism continues to evolve. In actuality, our institutions aren't all that dissimilar from those of colonialism, slavery, and segregation, and racism is still tolerated, accepted, and even actively encouraged in many aspects of American life. The uneasiness with race and racism in the dominant American culture continues to produce detrimental beliefs and sentiments that foster ignorance about racism and maintain the racial status quo. Maybe you've heard someone say something like colorblind, don't perceive color, or race doesn't matter. Perhaps you've even said anything along those lines. Those views, while often portrayed as inclusive, effectively shut down vital debates about race and deny that racism is a structural problem as well as an individual problem. It's the same as saying all lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter. This denial of race's importance is a technique used by the dominant racial group to justify racism impact under the pretense of individual merit. People in positions of power can credit their triumphs to their own hard work, whereas disadvantaged ethnic groups might blame their disadvantages on personal rather than institutional shortcomings. Supporting this individualistic American narrative blinds us to the realities of the country's racial systems. For example, research has clearly demonstrated that there are differences in income, employment, education, and health among Black Americans. However, studies demonstrate that white Americans are still less conscious of these racial realities than members of racial minority groups. But what are the roots of racism? How do we explain where it comes from? Many more people are seeking explanations for the racism that is ingrained in our society as more attention is paid to it. Is it a psychological defense mechanism to help people connect with a particular group and feel more safe? Or is it survival of the fittest? A list of putative psychological causes for racism is provided below. Personal insecurity. Those who lack a sense of self and are insecure may seek group participation. As a result, after a group has formed, its members may begin to alienate non-group members. Hostility can sometimes be directed against those who have been marginalized. People who are part of a clique are more likely to think and act like the people they hang out with. When you're surrounded by people who hold the same opinion as you, it's much easier to attack them. Racism emerges when people establish groups based on shared features such as race, which are encouraged by superiority beliefs and backed by oppressive systems. Lack of compassion. Others' alienation leads to a lack of compassion for people who have been marginalized. People begin to demonstrate compassion and empathy only for the people with whom they have a frequent interaction. Consider television segments that encourage viewers to donate to causes that help African families maintain their food security. If a person does not identify with the group or culture that needs help, these signals may be easy to disregard. This dismissal can be overtly racist or not, but it all starts with a lack of empathy. Projection of flaws. When people are unhappy with themselves or acknowledge their flaws, rather than confronting them and attempting to correct them, they may project their self-loathing onto others. Those who disregard their own personal defects might easily make alienated groups scapegoats. Poor mental health. Is racism an indication of a mental illness? It isn't always the case, but it is a possibility. Paranoid personality disorder and narcissism, for example, are both mental illnesses marked by feelings of insecurity, which can lead to racist views and acts. It's crucial to note, however, that racist attitudes and behaviors aren't limited to persons who suffer from mental illnesses. Hatred and fear. Fear is almost usually at the root of extreme hatred. People who are different or foreign might make people feel intimidated. They might be afraid of losing power. Some people may seek social support from those who have similar anxieties to help them overcome their fears, thus continuing the cycle. Hierarchy. Wealth, power, and influence are distributed unequally between groups in a hierarchical system. The dominant group believes that they are superior to non-dominant groups because of views that credit power and status to individual attributes rather than systematic effects. Racism is perpetuated in part due to the media. On one level, there's simply a lack of representation. When the media displays a predominantly white cast of actors in publications, television shows, and films, the white culture becomes the dominant or typical American culture. The ability to establish a society that favors them is granted to groups with power. It also enables them to set culturally acceptable criteria. They have complete control over resources and are free to exploit and dominate others. Advantages are distributed along racial divides when authority is distributed along racial divides, as it is in the United States. Another issue is how racial groupings are portrayed in the media. Individual racial prejudice and the structures that perpetuate institutionalized racism are both reinforced when the media repeats racial stereotypes in its representation of various racial groupings. Children's understanding of racism is influenced by how they learn about American history. One research, for example, looked at how Black History Month was taught in schools with primarily white and predominantly Black students. The researchers discovered significant disparities in the presentation of information. Students in primarily white schools were exposed to abstract exhibits and debates that focused on individual accomplishments rather than tackling prejudice. However, in predominantly Black schools, information focused more explicitly on racism and the consequences of racial barriers. Racism has been left to the past or reduced to individual ideas and acts for far too long. As a result, America's continuing systematic and institutionalized racism has gone unnoticed, allowing it to continue and flourish. However, cultural psychological approaches to analyzing racism cast doubt on these assumptions. Racism is more of a cultural phenomenon than a psychological occurrence in many aspects. This suggests that you don't have to be racist to support racist policies. We all have a personal obligation to confront racism on a personal level, but we must also consider the societal institutions that perpetuate individual bias and the unfairness that racism produces. With this, we have come to the end of our video. If you enjoyed it, do like, share, subscribe to our channel for more such exciting content. See you in the next video.